Have you ever stopped to wonder what people in the Middle Ages did when their minds started to unravel? When they felt that creeping dread in their chest? When they couldn't stop crying for reasons they couldn't name? Or when reality began to slip sideways and nothing felt quite real anymore? Today, we might turn to therapy, medication, journaling, or at the very least, a late-night internet search to explain what we're going through. But in medieval Europe, if your soul felt heavy or your thoughts became a storm, the solutions were dramatically different. Imagine telling someone in 13th century France that you felt anxious or depressed. Their first question wouldn't be, have you been sleeping well? Or, do you want to talk about it? More likely it'd be, when was the last time you were bled? Or worse, have you considered the moon might be driving you mad? But pie. Because in the Middle Ages, mental health wasn't just misunderstood. It was mythologized, spiritualized, and in many cases, flat-out feared. There were no diagnoses, no psychological models, no talk, therapy. What you had were bodily fluids, called humors, believed to govern everything from your temperament to your sanity. If you were sad, that was too much black bile. If you were erratic, maybe yellow bile. A treatment, a knife, a bucket. Some leeches, maybe prayer, maybe chains. And that was just the beginning. To be mentally unwell was to be spiritually suspect. People didn't just believe you were suffering. They believed something had invaded you. Maybe the devil, maybe the stars, maybe a forgotten sin from years ago now, demanding a toll. The line between illness and possession was thin, overt, and crossing it could mean exile, isolation. This wasn't fringe thinking. This was the thinking. Physicians, monks, astrologers, and neighbors all shared a worldview where emotional pain wasn't something to explore. It was something to purge. But here's the strange thing. In their own way, medieval people were trying to understand the mind. They asked questions. They made observations. They created entire systems to explain why someone might break under pressure or lose touch with reality. The problem wasn't that they didn't care. It est that they had no tools to tell the difference between sadness and sin. So tonight, we're stepping into that world. A world where crying too much could get you, where sleeping poorly was a sign of demonic influence, and where being too happy might land you in confession. We're peeling back the layers of myth, medicine, and fear to uncover what it really meant to struggle mentally in the Middle Ages, and how those beliefs shaped centuries of stigma. We restill unpacking today, because while the science has changed, the fear of what we don't understand, that's eternal, befall fluids that control your soul. To understand how mental health was viewed in medieval times, you have to start with one simple and slightly gross concept. The four humors. For centuries, the medical world in Europe revolved around this bizarre system. It wasn't based on science, as we know it today. It wasn't even based on observation, really. It was based on an idea that your body was filled with 4 magical fluids. And if they got out of balance, so did you. This theory came from the ancient Greeks, specifically Hippocrates and Galen. But medieval Europe adopted it with almost religious devotion. According to the theory, your physical and mental health depended on the right mix of blood, bile, black bile, and phlegm. Each one was associated with a specific temperament, an internal climate, and even a season. It was medical astrology with body fluid. Let's break it down. Blah was warm and moist. It made you sanguine, cheerful, social, energetic. Basically, the life of the medieval feast. But too much of it. That was a problem. It could make you hyper-annoying, even dangerously manic. The treatment, bloodletting, of course. Open a vein and drain the excess happiness. Yellow bile was hot and dry. This one made you choleric, ambitious, irritable, quick to anger. The kind of person who would thrive in battle but be absolutely unbearable at dinner. Excess yellow bile meant rage, impulsiveness, and what we might now call intermittent explosive disorder. Medieval solution. Possibly a purge, maybe a diet of cooling herbs, or if that failed, more bloodlet. Black bile was cold and dry, and gave rise to the melancholic temperament. Serious, introspective, and yes, depressed. If you were quiet, withdrawn, and prone to sadness, doctors believed your system had been flooded with black bile. Treatments varied but often involved laxatives, dietary restrictions, and spiritual correction. After all, if your mood was low, maybe your morals were too. Phlegm with cold and wet. It made you phlegmatic, calm, sluggish, emotionally detached. Not necessarily a bad thing in a monk or a farmer, but if you got too, people thought you were lazy, dim-witted, or spiritually dull. You might be treated with warming herbs, exercise, or again, blood, because, no matter the condition, draining people's blood was the medieval version of take 2 Advil and call me in the morning. Now, this might all sound like folklore, and in a way, it was. But this wasn't fringe medicine. This was the mainstream. Universities taught it. Royal physicians practiced it. Monks copied it into manuscripts for generations. The humoral system dominated Western medicine. For over 1,000 years, longer than many modern treatments have even existed. But what does this have to do with mental health? Everything. In the medieval mind, emotions weren't seen as psychological. They were physical. Sadness, wasn't a sign of grief or trauma. It was black bile clogging up your inner plumbing. Anxiety wasn't fear of the future. It was a heat imbalance in your blood. Anger, just your yellow bile boiling over. Even personality wasn't considered something you were born with. It was something your fluids decided for you. And here's where things get darker. The treatments were just as misguided as the theory. If you were melancholic, the cure wasn't compassion or care. It was usually violent. A doctor might prescribe leeches, vomiting, fasting, or enema before. Sorrow didn't live. They assumed the treatment hadn't gone far enough. No one asked why you were sad. They just assumed your body needed to be drained like a clogged pipe. And if you resisted, if you screamed or cried or refused to be cut open again, that wasn't seen as fear. That was interpreted as stubbornness, a moral flaw. After all, if you really wanted to get better, you'd submit to the cure. And we haven't even talked about diagnosis yet. Physicians, and we're using that term very loosely here, would examine your urine, smell your breath, ask you if you felt moist or dry that day, and then align your symptoms with planetary position. Because in their world, the stars and your stomach were basically part of the same system. A patient might come in complaining of persistent sadness, irrational fears, or hallucinations, and the doctor's response would be to check your horoscope and sniff your pee. If the stars aligned and your fluids were off, you were declared imbalanced. If they couldn't figure it out, you were labeled untreatable, or worse, spiritually afflicted. But here's what's truly wild. People believed in this system. They trusted it because in a world without neuroscience, psychology, or even basic hygiene, humors offered something powerful, an explanation, a reason why you felt the way you did. And in that sense, it gave people control, or at least the illusion of it. If you were sad, it wasn't your fault. It was your black bile. If you were angry, it was the yellow bile talking. In some strange way, it allowed people to see mental illness as something natural, something inside the body, not outside the soul. That's a step up from assuming you're possessed, right? Well, yes and no. Because while the humor theory did create a framework for understanding mental distress, it also paved the way for centuries of harmful treatments and a general sense that mental health was a problem of bodily failure, not emotional pain, trauma, or inner conflict. It turned suffering into a plumbing issue, and, unfortunately, the medieval solutions were often more brutal than the problems they tried to fix. Absolutely. Here's section 2, extended to around 1,000 words, continuing in the same engaging, insightful, and occasionally humorous tone. This section dives into the cosmic and celestial influences medieval people believed could impact mental health, especially the moon and the stars. When the moon made you mad, astrology, lunacy, and celestial blame. Let's imagine you're living in a little village in 13th century England. You've been sleeping poorly, getting anxious for no obvious reason, pacing around your one-room cottage, muttering about taxes, wolf, and the state of your roof. You think it might be nerves, maybe grief, but your neighbors, they're pretty sure it's the moon. Yes, the moon. In the Middle Ages, people firmly believed that mental health wasn't just a matter of body fluids. Ahaha. It was also a matter of celestial interference. Bet, bright, glowing orb in the sky. Wasn't he just lighting your way to the outhouse? It was messing with your mind. The belief was so widespread that it shaped language. The word lunatic comes from luna, the Latin word for moon. And while today it's a derogatory term best left to history, back then it was a legitimate medical label. If someone behaved erratically, heard voices, had wild mood swings, or stripped naked and danced in the woods, it wasn't trauma, it wasn't stress, it wasn't a neurodivergent experience. It was the full moon getting a little too personal. And this wasn't just a peasant superstition whispered behind ale mugs. This was mainstream belief, shared by doctors, priests, scholars, and even the occasional monarch. Medical texts written by university-trained physicians routinely referenced the moon's phases when discussing diet. Clergy warned that certain spiritual afflictions became more common during lunar events. Even legal systems sometimes factored in the full moon when deciding if someone was fit to stand trial. Why all this moon-based blame? Well, part of it goes back to the ancient Greeks again. Hippocrates and Galen, the same guys who gave us the four humors, also believed that the moon had an effect on the human body because of its connection to water, just as the moon controlled the tides. They thought it could also control the watery parts of the human body, and that included the brain, which they assumed was kind of like a moist sponge sloshing around inside your skull. So, if the moon could pull oceans, surely it could tug on your thoughts. Right. That logic persisted for centuries. Medieval physicians genuinely thought that the full moon stirred up your brain fluids, triggering episodes of madness. In one medical manuscript from the 12th century, the author claims that exposure to moonlight could cause disturbances of the humors, especially in women, leading to madness, visions, blau, or speaking in tongues. In other words, if you were feeling off, and it happened to be a full moon, case closed. What did this mean for people experiencing mental health issues? Well, for starters, it meant that your calendar was working against you. If you had a breakdown near the full moon, people assumed you were moonstruck. They didn't consider your emotional well-being or social circumstances. Instead, they might tie you up, isolate you, or drag you to the local church for urgent prayer until the moon waned and you returned to normal. Some towns even had designated cells, or isolation huts, for those suffering what we now call psychiatric episodes. Spaces where they could be protected from the moon's influence. It was a kind of medieval wellness retreat, minus the wellness and plus a lot of superstition. The moon wasn't alone in this celestial conspiracy either. Astrology played a massive role in medieval medicine. Long before Mercury in retrograde became a meme, people genuinely believed that planetary alignment could ruin your mental health. If you were born under the wrong star, experienced a Saturn-Mars conjunction, or had the misfortune of Venus being in a bad mood, your mental and emotional state could be deemed unstable. Medieval astrologers were often consulted alongside physicians. They would cast horoscopes, examine natal charts, and determine whether your distemper was due to Jupiter's influence, or maybe the unfortunate timing of your conception. Medical handbooks from the period are littered with charts and tables explaining how the positions of heavenly bodies correspond to the body's organs and humor. Saturn, for example, was associated with melancholy and chronic illness. If your black bile was acting up, it was probably Saturn's fault. Mars brought fever and rage. Think road rage. But on horseback, the moon, that was tied directly to your brain. Too much lunar exposure, and your thoughts could unravel like a poorly spun tapestry. What's fascinating here is that astrology wasn't considered unscientific. Quite the opposite. Astrology was a central part of early medical education. Universities like Oxford and Paris had entire departments dedicated to the study of celestial influence. To be a well-educated physician in the 14th century, you had to know your humors and your horoscopes. And while this sounds quaint today, it had real consequences. If a physician misread the stars or timed a treatment wrong, according to the moon part, they could be accused of malpractice, or worse, of dabbling in forbidden magic, because the line between science and superstition was very, very blurry. Even more curiously, animals weren't exempt from celestial damage. Farmers swore their sheep acted strangely under a full moon. Dogs were said to howl more, and horses to become jittery. If your livestock misbehaved, no need to check for wolves or bad oats. The moon was clearly up to something. So, what do we make of all this? In a way, the medieval obsession with the moon and stars reflects something profoundly human. The need for explanations when people didn't understand mental illness, when they had no language for depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia. They turned to the sky for answers. If your mind betrayed you, at least you could blame something visible, tangible, eternal, and oddly enough, this worldview could be comforting. The belief that your suffering had a cosmic cause gave it meaning. It turned to mental illness from a personal failure into part of a grand celestial story. Maybe the stars had just dealt you a tough hand this month. Maybe next month would be better. Of course, the downside is obvious. These beliefs often prevented real care. Instead of helping people process grief or trauma, they were isolated, scolded, Instead of compassion, they got fear. Fear of madness, fear of the moon, fear of the unknown. But in their defense, medieval people weren't being willfully ignorant. They were using the best tools they had: observation, tradition, pattern recognition, and a bit of poetic imagination. In the absence of neuroscience, they reached for the sky. So, next time someone tells you that astrology is harmless, just remember, in the Middle Ages, your birth chart might have been used to diagnose your depression, decide your medical treatment, or explain why you screamed at a cabbage. The stars weren't just guides. Were your therapists, your doctors, and occasionally your scapegoats. Certainly. Here is Section 3, written in the same vivid, accessible style, and expanded to around 1,000 words. This section focuses on the role of the Church in medieval mental health, and how theology, morality, and fear shaped how people understood and treated emotional or psychological distress, sins, saints, and sadness. When the Church was your therapist, imagine you're a medieval villager again. You've been You wake up with dread in your chest. Your hands tremble for no reason. You burst into tears at odd moments. And some days it feels like there's a lead blanket wrapped around your soul. There, ask no word for mental health in your world, but something you senti right. So what do? You don't go to a therapist. You don't call a doctor. You certainly don't hop on web. No, in the Middle Ages, your first stop is likely the church. Because in the medieval mind, your thoughts and emotions weren't just psychological. They were spiritual. The mind was considered a sacred battleground, a place where God, angels, demons, and your own sinful nature all wrestled for control. Any sign of mental disturbance was often interpreted as a sign of moral failing, divine punishment, or spiritual attack. This wasn't fringe theology. It was the dominant worldview. Whether you were a farmer or a noble, rich or poor, educated or illiterate, your emotional pain was often understood as a symptom of sin. So, if you were sad, anxious, or hallucinating, the diagnosis might be that you had offended God, or worse, that the devil had set up shop in your soul. The church wasn't just a place of worship in this era. It was also the center of social life, moral authority, and practical advice. Priests were the go-to guides, not only for your spiritual life, but for your health, happiness, and sanity. If you're confessed to hearing voices or having terrifying thoughts, you wouldn't get a therapy referral. You'd get a confessional booth, a rosary, and possibly some fasting instructions. At the heart of this theology was the belief that human suffering, all suffering, had purpose. Everything from the flu to heartbreak to a breakdown in the village square was considered either a test from God, a punishment for sin, or a temptation from the devil, trying to lure your soul off the path of righteousness. In this framework, depression was sometimes seen as a spiritual condition described by early Christian monks. Acedia wasn't sadness in the modern sense. It was a kind of soul-weary listlessness, a mixture of boredom, despair, and apathy. It often hit monks who were isolated in their cells, staring at the same stone wall day after day, chanting the same psalms until the hours blurred. Sound familiar? Bah! Instead of being treated with compassion, acedia was labeled a spiritual vice, something dangerously close to sloth, one of the 7 deadly sins. The cure. Not emotional support, but prayer, discipline, and penance. If your symptoms were more dramatic, hearing voices, speaking in tongues, seeing visions, putto, or falling into trances, the church might interpret it as either a sign of sainthood, a case of demonic possession, or evidence of heresy, witchcraft, or madness. let's not gloss over this. For many people, especially women, mental illness or emotional intensity was a risky business. Women who cried too much, expressed grief too publicly, or acted out under stress were often viewed with suspicion. Were they witches? Were they possessed? Had they been consorting with the devil? Even when they weren't accused outright, they were often silenced, punished, or forcibly healed. This healing could take many forms. Poor, milder cases, the Church encouraged confession, unburdening your soul to a priest, listing your sins, repenting, and performing acts of penance. This might involve saying prayers, giving to the poor, attending Mass more often, or fasting for days. The belief was that by cleansing your soul, you could heal your mind. If that didn't work, or if your condition was more visible, you might be subjected to exorcism, a ritual designed to drive demons out of your body. Exorcisms weren't always as dramatic as movies make them seem, but they could be deeply traumatic. The afflicted person might be restrained, anointed with holy water, shouted at by priests, and surrounded by villagers, praying and crossing themselves. There were two types: minor exorcisms, which involved prayers and blessings, and major exorcisms, which could include rituals lasting hours or even days. And here's the chilling truth. People often believed in these treatments. The rituals provided structure, meaning, and a sense that something was being done. In a world without modern medicine, where neuroscience didn't exist, the idea that your suffering was caused by a devil, and that it could be removed, offered a strange kind of hope. Still, the Church's approach wasn't always brutal. There were also compassionate monks and nuns who offered care, shelter, and routine to those struggling mentally. Monasteries sometimes acted as the closest thing to psychiatric hospitals. People who were unwell could be placed in monastic cells, away from the public, where they'd be offered prayer, food, and silence. Silence was considered healing. The idea was that stillness and solitude would calm the troubled soul. But, of course, that depended on the individual. For some, it probably helped. For others, it may have made things worse, especially if they were left alone with their demons, both literal and figurative. Some monastic orders also believed in the healing power of chanting, relics, and rituals. You might be asked to touch a fragment of a saint's bone, sleep near a holy object, or recite a specific psalm 100 times. It was spiritual therapy in its own way. Yet the underlying message remained the same. Your suffering had moral meaning. You weren't just ill. You weren't danger of damnation. And that belief shaped how people viewed themselves and others. It created stigma, fear, and shame, but also a sense of cosmic order. Pain wasn't meaningless. It was part of a divine plan. So was this a form of therapy, in a way? Yes. The Church provided community, routine, structure, and a moral framework. It gave people explanations for their pain, however flawed, and in the absence of doctors or medication, that was sometimes the best support available. By but it also misdiagnosed, mistreated, and misunderstood countless people. Bill, those suffering from trauma, grief, psychosis, or developmental conditions were labeled as sinful, possessed, or weak. Their needs were often ignored in favor of ritual. It's easy to scoff at these ideas now, but the truth is, the impulse to spiritualize mental health, to see it as a matter of morality or divine punishment, hasn't entirely disappeared. Even today, some still believe depression is a failure of character, or that anxiety is a sign of weak faith. The difference now is we know better, or at least we can. In the Middle Ages, the Church was both therapist and judge. Its intentions may have been pastoral, but its tools were often primitive. Still, for the lonely, the terrified, and the misunderstood, sometimes even a flawed system offered a glimmer of comfort. A priest's calm voice, a chapel's quiet light, the simple reassurance that your suffering had not gone unnoticed. Locked away, confinement, isolation, and the medieval response to madness. As we continue our journey through medieval mental health, it is time to confront one of the more somber realities. When someone's mind wandered too far from what the community considered normal, the response was often not healing but containment. Unlike today, where mental health care involves therapy, medication, or community support, the Middle Ages had few options for those suffering severe mental disturbances. If a person was considered dangerously irrational, disruptive, or simply incomprehensible, they faced a grim choice. Isolation, confinement, or worse. The fear of madness and the need for control in medieval society. Order was everything. The world was hierarchical and rigidly structured, from kings to peasants, angels to demons, saints to sinners. Madness threatened that order. It was unpredictable, disruptive, and frightening. Imagine a villager suddenly screaming in the market, wandering barefoot through fields at night, or ranting about invisible enemies. The community wouldn't have had the language or tools to understand trauma, psychosis, or neurological conditions. Instead, such behavior was seen as a threat to social and spiritual harmony. Because mental illness was often interpreted as sin or possession, those afflicted were feared. The medieval response was to remove the threat from public life, sometimes for the person's safety, but often for the community's peace of mind. Monastic cells, mercy, or prison. One of the most common places for confining the mentally disturbed was the monastery. Far from being just religious retreats, many monasteries had designated cells or rooms where troubled souls could be placed under supervision. These weren't prisons, in the modern sense. No iron bars or chain, but they were places of forced isolation. A cell might be a small, windowed room, often bare stone, with a single door locked from the outside and no doorknob on the inside. Escape wasn't encouraged. Why the monastery? Because the monks were seen as spiritual caretakers, and their daily routine of prayer, fasting, enchanting was thought to be therapeutic, or at least spiritually cleansing. The hope was that The disciplined environment would calm the mind, drive out evil influences, and restore order to the soul. Yet, this treatment was far from gentle. Being locked away, even with food and water, could exacerbate feelings of despair or madness. Without understanding mental health, confinement often became a form of punishment disguised as care. The Lapison's cell, protective isolation or social exile. Outside monasteries, some towns had informal ways to isolate people considered mad or dangerous. This might mean being confined to a small room in your own home, locked away by family members who didn't know how to cope. Sometimes local authorities would step in, placing individuals in custodial care. If you were poor and homeless, your fate might be worse, wandering the streets as a vagrant madman, begging for coins, shunned by most and pitied by few. Add the extreme. Some places built block hospitals or small asylums, though these were rare and not yet medical institutions as we think of them today. These spaces were more about containment than cure, places to keep the community safe from madness. Why such harsh measures? You might wonder, was confinement really the only option? Was there no compassion? The answer is complicated. Compassion existed, especially within religious communities, but it was often overwhelmed by fear, misunderstanding, and limited knowledge. Medieval people did not understand mental illness as a health condition. Without medicine or psychiatry, madness was often viewed as evidence of demonic possession, moral failure, cursed bloodlines, divine punishment. That meant the response was sometimes more about spiritual correction than healing. Isolation was seen as a form of discipline, a way to allow the afflicted to repent, reflect, and hopefully be restored. In some cases, this was coupled with prayer vigils, fasting, and religious instruction, a slow, grueling, spiritual rehabilitation. The role of families, protectors and prisoners. Families bore much of the burden for care. If a loved one showed signs of madness, it was often up to relatives to decide what to do. For some families, keeping the person at home locked away in a spare room or cellar was the best they could do. They might hide them away to avoid shame or protect the family's reputation. Others tried to find help from the church or local healers. But this wasn't always possible. Sometimes families became caregivers out of necessity, but lacked the resources or knowledge to offer proper support. This could lead to neglect or abuse, albeit unintentional. Confinement and the law. In some medieval towns, local laws addressed what to do with people considered mad or dangerous. For instance, if a person was violent or disruptive, authorities might detain them temporarily for the community's safety. But the legal system was not designed to protect the individual's rights or dignity, as we would expect today. Instead, it was more about public order and protection from harmful behavior. Mental incapacity was sometimes grounds for losing property rights or control over one's affairs, which could lead to institutionalization or guardianship, without much say from the afflicted person. The early origins of asylums by the late medieval period. Some cities began founding institutions specifically intended to house the insane. These were precursors to modern psychiatric hospitals, but functioned quite differently. They were often places of last resort, designed primarily to separate those deemed dangerous or disturbing from society, rather than to treat or rehabilitate them. Conditions were usually harsh, overcrowded, underfunded, and punitive. People might be chained, beaten, or neglected. Hygiene was poor, and understanding of mental illness was minimal, while tragic by modern standards. These early asylums reflected a growing societal need to manage mental illness as a public issue, not just a private or spiritual one. The paradox of isolation. Isolation was a double-edged sword. For some, removal from a chaotic or stressful environment might have provided temporary relief. Monastic routines of prayer and meditation could bring moments of peace. But for many others, forced confinement led to increased loneliness and despair, worsening of symptoms due to lack of stimulation or human contact, physical deterioration from neglect or poor conditions, stigma, and social death. Even if they were eventually released, how did people survive this? Survival often depended on community attitude, family support, and sheer luck. Some fortunate individuals might find compassionate monks or nuns who offered quiet company and basic care. Others found solace in faith and ritual, clinging to prayers and relics to give their suffering meaning. Still, many languished unseen, forgotten by society. Reflecting on medieval confinement, looking back, Breville approach to mental health, especially confinement, reveals a complex mix of fear, faith, and limited knowledge. There was no system as we understand it. Instead, a patchwork of local customs, religious practices, and family decisions shaped the fate of those struggling with their minds. Though often harsh and misguided, these responses were shaped by the cultural and spiritual realities of the time. They remind us how far we've come in understanding and caring for mental health, and how much courage it takes to face the unknown in any era. Healing minds, medieval treatments and remedies for mental health. As we've seen, medieval understandings of mental health were deeply intertwined with the humors, the spiritual realm, and community fears. But what about the treatments? When someone was deemed melancholic, anxious, or possessed, what tools did healers, priests, and families reach for to ease their suffering? Surprisingly, despite the limited medical knowledge and the often harsh spiritual interventions, medieval Europe had a diverse arsenal of treatments, ranging from physical procedures and herbal remedies to prayer, ritual, and lifestyle changes. In this section, we'll explore the fascinating, sometimes bizarre, and often heartfelt methods medieval people used in their quest to heal troubled minds. The humoral approach, balancing the inner soup. Remember the theory of the four humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. The cornerstone of medieval medicine was to restore balance among these bodily fluids, since imbalance was believed to cause both physical and mental illness. The preferred method to rebalance humors was often blood. This could involve leeches, or the more direct approach of cutting a vein to drain excess blood, with the hope that purging the body of too much of a certain humor would restore health. While it sounds brutal and often, bloodletting was a common prescription not just for melancholy or anxiety, but a wide variety of ailments. Physicians believed that draining blood would reduce the overabundance of sanguine energy or dampen the fire of choleric anger. Alongside bloodletting, purging through laxatives and emetics was another popular treatment. The logic: if your body's fluids were out of balance, emptying your bowels might flush away toxins affecting your mind and spirit. Herbal medicine, nature's pharmacy in a world before pharmaceuticals, herbs and plants were the primary medicines. Monasteries were centers of herbal knowledge, cultivating gardens and copying texts on healing. Several herbs were prized for their supposed calming or mood-lifting properties. Some of the favorites included valerian root, known for its sedative effects. It was used to ease anxiety and insomnia. Lavender, used for relaxation and to ward off evil spirits. St. John's wort, known as Bersanitis. This plant was thought to treat melancholy. Chamomile, for soothing nerves and aiding digestion. Hellebore, a powerful albeit dangerous plant sometimes used to cleanse the mind of evil or madness, though its toxicity made it risky. These herbs were administered as teas, tinctures, poultices, or even sprinkled on wounds or clothing. Sometimes the ritual of preparation and the faith in the herb's power were as important as the chemical effects. Diet and lifestyle, the medieval wellness plan. The idea that diet influences mood isn't new. Medieval physicians often recommended dietary adjustments to balance humors and improve mental states. For example, if you were melancholic, you might be advised to eat warming foods like garlic, onions, or meat, while avoiding cold or dry foods like cucumbers or raw vegetables. Physical activity was encouraged to stimulate blood flow and warm the body, especially for those with sluggish, phlegmatic dispositions. Sleep hygiene was also considered vital. Although understanding of circadian rhythms was minimal, rest and avoiding excessive mental stimulation were often prescribed, sometimes enforced through monastic routines or isolation, prayer, pilgrimage, and religious ritual. Since mental illness was deeply spiritual, prayer and ritual were cornerstone treatments. Daily prayers, chanting, psalms, fasting, and attending Mass were believed to strengthen the soul against evil influences. Pilgrimages to holy sites, such as the shrine of St. Dymphna, the patron saint of mental illness, were common. Pilgrims sought healing through contact with sacred relics and the intercession of saints. Religious rituals were sometimes combined with medical treatment, creating a holistic approach to body and soul. Exorcism, the dramatics of deliverance for cases deemed demonic possession or extreme spiritual disturbance. Exorcism was the dramatic go-to. These ceremonies, ranging from mild prayers to intense theatrical rituals, were attempts to evict the evil spirit causing madness. The process could involve holy water, relics, chanting, and physical gestures like the sign of the cross. Sometimes it was a public event, part healing ritual, part community spectacle. While terrifying to the afflicted, exorcisms reflected the belief the spiritual healing was paramount and sometimes the only path to mental wellness. Music and art. Early therapies for the soul, less commonly discussed but quite significant, were music and art as forms of therapy. Monks often used chanting and sacred music to induce calm and contemplation. The repetitive and melodic nature of Gregorian chant was believed to harmonize the mind and spirit. Pi. In some courts and monasteries, creating art or engaging in crafts provided a meditative outlet, offering distraction from distress and fostering a sense of purpose. Though not formally recognized as therapy, these activities undoubtedly had soothing effects. The role of community and social interaction. Mental health care in medieval times wasn't solely individual. Community played a crucial role. In villages, neighbors might gather around someone showing signs of distress to provide comfort or supervision. Festivals, church gatherings, and communal prayers acted as social support networks, offering routine and inclusion. Even for those struggling, of course. Social stigma also existed, sometimes pushing the afflicted to isolation or confinement. But the community's presence could be a source of strength. Limitations and risks of medieval treatments. Despite the range of remedies, medieval treatments carried significant risks. Bloodletting could weaken a patient or cause infections. Toxic herbs, like hellebore, might do more harm than good. Fasting and sleep deprivation, intended as spiritual purifications, could worsen mental state. Exorcisms sometimes escalated distress rather than alleviating it. Social isolation and confinement could compound suffering. Without modern scientific understanding, many treatments were guesswork intertwined with faith and tradition. Legacy of medieval mental health care. While many medieval treatments seem harsh or misguided today, laid the groundwork for evolving mental health care. The emphasis on holistic care, body, mind, and spirit, resonates even now. Monastic herbal gardens contributed to early pharmacology, and the communal and ritualistic aspects of care remind us that healing is often about more than just medicine. It is about meaning, connection, and hope. Final thoughts on medieval healing. Medieval Europe's approach to mental health treatment was a complex tapestry of medical theory, spiritual belief, and practical care. Far from purely barbaric, it reflected the best knowledge available at the time and a genuine desire to alleviate suffering. while the tools were imperfect and often harsh. By the medieval healers and clergy sought to restore balance and harmony to troubled minds in a world where the boundaries between body, mind, and spirit were deeply intertwined. This chapter in the history of mental health reminds us how far we've come and how cultural perspectives shape the care we offer those in need. Here's Section 6, focusing on the fate of those with severe mental illness in medieval times, including isolation, social stigma, and the harsh realities they often faced. This section will be detailed and engaging, aiming for around 1,000 words. Be shadows of the mind, isolation, stigma, and survival in medieval mental health. When mental distress moved beyond fleeting sadness or mild melancholy, the medieval world's response could be harsh and unforgiving. Unlike today's approach, which increasingly emphasizes understanding, compassion, and therapy, the Middle Ages often viewed severe mental illness through a lens of fear, misunderstanding, and moral judgment. In this section, we explore the grim realities faced by those whose minds wandered too far from what society deemed normal, the isolations imposed on them, and the ways stigma shaped their daily lives. When the mind broke, signs of severe mental illness in medieval Europe, symptoms we now recognize as signs of severe mental mutism, extreme mood swings, or erratic behavior, not just medical issues. They were seen as spiritual crises or moral failings. A person wandering the streets, talking to themselves or animal, prayer, or showing disorganized thoughts, wasn't met with empathy, but suspicion. Were they possessed, cursed, a danger to themselves and others, without the tools to understand neurological or psychological conditions? The response was often exclusion, protective isolation, the monastic cell and beyond, for those deemed too disturbed for everyday life. Isolation was a common solution. This could take the form of a monastic cell or a small room within a church or monastery, designed to separate and contain the afflicted. These cells, sometimes called protective isolation rooms, were not prisons. In the modern sense, there was no expectation of punishment, but freedom was heavily restricted. Often there was no doorknob on the inside, and the room had a small window or grate for food and prayer. Isolation was seen as an act of mercy, protecting both the individual and society. It was hoped that through solitude, prayer, and spiritual discipline, the soul might be purified and the mind restored. However, the experience could be devastating. Days spent alone with little stimulation, strict fasting, and constant reminders of sin could worsen mental distress or lead to despair. Confinement and custody. Families and communities struggle. Not all confinement was religious or still. In many cases, families or communities took responsibility for their mentally ill members, often with limited resources or understanding. Those exhibiting dangerous or uncontrollable behaviors might be chained or confined at home. Some were sent to the care of monasteries or hospitals that functioned more as places of custody than healing. The line between care and containment was thin. without effective treatments. The focus was often on preventing harm rather than recovery. The stigma of madness, social exclusion, and fear. Madness was heavily stigmatized. Mental illness was often interpreted as a punishment for sin or evidence of moral weakness. This stigma extended beyond the individual to their family, who might face social shame or economic hardship. People feared those with mental disturbances, believing they were unpredictable or dangerous. This fear sometimes led to violent rejection or abuse. On the other hand, it's important to note that some communities showed remarkable patience and care, incorporating troubled individuals into daily life as best they could. The role of hospitals and asylums, early institutions. While medieval Europe didn't have mental hospitals as we know them, some institutions provided rudimentary care. Hospitals connected to monasteries might accept the mentally ill, offering shelter, food, and basic care. Though the focus was often on spiritual healing, some cities developed asylums or houses of confinement by the late Middle Ages. But conditions were harsh and treatments rudimentary. These early institutions reflected society's desire to manage mental illness, but were far from therapeutic environment. Punishment or mercy, the blurred lines sometimes. Those with severe mental illness faced punishment rather than care, especially if behavior was seen as criminal or blasphemous. There are records of people being publicly humiliated, beaten, or imprisoned. Yet, in many cases, harsh treatment was justified as mercy or a way to save the soul, reflecting a complex mixture of fear, compassion, and misunderstanding. The power of faith and community. Support, despite these challenges. Monks, nuns, and clergy often provided companionship, routine, and hope. Communal prayer and ritual created a framework for meaning, even amid suffering. Some individuals found solace in pilgrimages, sacred relics, or participation in religious festivals, connecting them to something larger than their pain. Legacy of medieval social responses, the medieval era. Beth's approach to severe mental illness was deeply flawed, but also foundational in some ways. It highlighted the need for community involvement, structured care, and recognition of mental distress, even if through a spiritual lens. Later centuries would build on this, evolving toward more humane and scientific approaches, reflecting on the shadows. The story of medieval mental health care is as much about society's fears and limitations as about the individuals who suffered. Isolation and stigma often compounded suffering, but there were also moments of care and compassion. Understanding this history reminds us why mental health care today demands empathy, knowledge, and respect for human dignity lessons, hard-won through centuries of struggle. What medieval mental health teaches us today, looking back at mental health in the Middle Ages, it is easy to see how far we've come, but also to appreciate how much the human experience of suffering remains unchanged. When people felt overwhelmed by anxiety, sadness, or confusion, their world was shaped not by science or psychology, but by beliefs. That mixed spirituality, superstition, and limited medical knowledge. The idea that our moods and minds could be controlled by bodily fluids. The influence of the moon, cruel or even demonic forces, might sound strange, or even cruel today, but for centuries, these were the only explanations available. People sought meaning in their pain and hope in their healing, however imperfect. What stands out most is the profound human need for care, understanding, and connection. A need that hasn't changed. Even when treatment involved bloodletting, exorcisms, or isolation, it was driven by the desire to relieve suffering and restore balance, however misguided by modern standards. The Middle Ages remind us that mental health has always been deeply personal, yet inseparable from the culture and beliefs around us. When science was scarce, faith and community filled the gaps, offering structure and sometimes comfort. But they also brought stigma and fear, often isolating those who needed support most. Today, with advances in neuroscience, psychology, and medicine, we have a far better chance to understand and help. Yet, the shadows of misunderstanding and stigma linger. The past encourages us to keep pushing for empathy and education, to challenge fear with knowledge, and to support those struggling silently around us. So next time you feel overwhelmed, remember, humanity has faced the mysteries of the mind for centuries, and our journey toward healing is ongoing. From ancient humors to modern therapy, each step reflects a deeper hope that no one should suffer alone, and everyone deserves a chance to find peace. If this exploration of medieval mental health sparked your curiosity or made you think differently, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that uncover the unexpected side of history. And tell me in the comments what surprised you most about how our ancestors understood the mind. Thanks for joining me on this journey through time. Until next time, take care of your mind and each other.